Hello and welcome to the Racing News 365.com podcast, looking ahead to this weekend's Miami Grand Prix. From Racing News 365.com, my name is Nick Golding, and I'm joined by, as always, by 2023 Young Journalist of the Year Sam Coop and lead editor Ian Puck. Gentlemen, it's the first race in the US this season, this weekend. It's the second consecutive sprint race of the season, and Ian, it's the first sprint race to be held in Miami. It's going to be a fascinating weekend once again.
First sprint race in Miami, definitely. It's going to offer something a little bit different. The first 2 years of the Miami Grand Prix have been a little bit hit and miss. The first one, as I'm sure you guys just cast your minds back a couple of years, a lot of criticism about the track surface, didn't particularly produce great racing. Few niggles about the circuit layout as well, in particular that kind of infield section, which was a little bit fiddly. Second year at least, they upgraded the circuit, resurfaced it, and it, for the most part, it made it quite a reasonable weekend of track action overall. The event itself, it's one of those destination events, so that also adds to the attraction for many people visiting. At least now, that those that are going to be in attendance this weekend, they've not only got the added attraction of Miami, they've got a good circuit, a reasonable circuit, and they've also got sprint session again. So, we were treated to what was a really good race, sprint race in Shanghai just a couple of weeks ago. Hopefully it's going to be the same again, because let's face it, guys, the Grand Prix in Shanghai was not much to write home about. But for the butterfly wing effect, of it, as I've previously described it, of that Valtteri Bottas retirement on track that led to the safety car, that led to the crashes, that led to the fallout, etc., etc. So fingers crossed we have a good weekend of track action and a lot more to talk about coming out of it.
Sam, as Ian just mentioned there, the sprint race in China was actually very, very good. Probably one of the best sprint races we've seen since the format was introduced. Do you expect the Miami circuit to suit the sprint format?
That's a tough question. I think it can do. There's some very good overtaking spots, particularly kind of towards the end of the lap and into the first corner. It's quick, it's flowing in points, when it isn't in the technical infield section, as Ian mentions. So I think it can do. I'm intrigued to see if that kind of combining the unpopular sprint weekend format, which is here to stay, as we know, but combining that with a racetrack or an event that hasn't particularly been that popular. I'm interested in to see if almost two wrongs make a right this weekend, and it somehow just kind of comes together, because as Ian says, it's a destination Grand Prix, and I think that is more easily conveyed for the people in attendance than those on TV, with the celebrity and the attention on the event itself. So I think it will lend to it, and also with the new format, the new rules, where you are able to make changes between the sprint element of the weekend and the Grand Prix element of the weekend. It shouldn't be too stale between the sprint and then the actual Grand Prix.
Ian, many of us don't get the luxury of being in an F1 paddock. You obviously mentioned during the Shanghai Chinese Grand Prix that the Shanghai paddock is absolutely massive. You are in the paddock again this weekend. What is the Miami paddock like? Is it the glitz and glam we kind of expect, given the area it is?
It's pretty much divided into two parts, because the paddock, as we know it, is kind of removed from what the fans can go and stroll around, those that have the paddock access, because from year one to year two, they decided to move the team buildings onto the actual Miami Dolphins Hard Rock Stadium pitch, which was just quite extraordinary when you stepped inside it. And then you're looking up all around you, and you've got all these empty grandstands, but with the paddock buildings, as I say, sat on the artificial turf, which was pretty cool, actually. Fans that can then go up to the top tier, it's called the 300 level inside the Hard Rock Stadium, and they can wander around that top tier, and they get these glorious views looking down and they can watch their heroes come and go in and out of the paddock buildings, making their way then across to the garages, which are then situated in a concourse outside of the actual stadium itself. So for me, pretty spectacular. One of the most, arguably the most spectacular paddock that I've come across during my time in Formula One. It really does lend itself to something quite different. The media centre is actually situated inside the stadium, and we're quite far removed. It takes a few minutes to get down to actually ground level where the paddock buildings are, but it's actually situated inside the media centre for the American football matches, the NFL games that take place there. So we have this, as I say, this wonderful view looking down on the pitch, and we can see all the drivers and the team principals coming and going just as much as the fans can up on the 300 level. Yeah, pretty spectacular, pretty special. Looking forward to it again this year.
In saying that, there was a story that you told Sam and myself before we started this, which I've got to ask about, because everyone, I guess, believes that following F1 around the world is a luxury, and you see all these incredible places. However, it's not always the case.
Yeah. Okay, so this is the third year of the Miami Grand Prix. First year, I decided to go back to Miami Beach. And I say go back to because many years previously, I'd been a guest of Audi covering the Sebring 12-hour. And I took a short few days break after that event, travelled down to Miami, spent a few days there on Miami Beach and absolutely loved it. So I thought, right, first year, Miami Grand Prix, I'm going to go back. Didn't quite live up to the expectation of that first visit. I found it a little bit run down, a little bit seedy in places. So last year, I thought, right, I'll move out of Miami Beach and I'll go up the coast to Hollywood Beach. Found that even slightly more run down, slightly more seedier. And I remember taking walks along the path along the beachfront. And I reckon I must have probably passive smoked probably about 3 spliffs that one particular walk because there was so much weed in the air. It was unbelievable. So this year, I've decided to go to Fort Lauderdale. I've moved even further up the coast. Funnily enough, neither Miami Beach nor Fort Lauderdale, they're both equidistant to the Hard Rock Stadium. But yeah, I had quite a high old time last year in Miami.
I was hoping you were going to say this year I've decided to cut out the middleman and just buy the weed myself.
Buy the weed myself. I think not. I don't think that would go down too well. But yeah, that'd be quite cool, wouldn't it? Because I got high here on the podcast.
The luxuries of traveling the world to cover Formula One, everybody. Let's move on. Let's quickly move on to last week's big news that came out a few days after the Chinese Grand Prix, and it involves Nico Hulkenberg, who will be leaving Haas at the end of this season to move to Stake F1 for 2025 so that he can drive for Audi in 2026. This is possibly one of the ultimate comeback stories, given that only a few years ago it looked like his F1 career was done and dusted, Sam.
Yeah, absolutely. Once Daniel Ricciardo joined him at Renault and then looked pretty comfortable against him. They obviously wanted to bring Ocon on, and that spelled the end of his time with Renault at the end of 2019. And then he had, 3 seasons on the sidelines, had a couple of sub-appearances for Racing Point and then what then became Aston Martin, and performed pretty well, to be fair, in some of those races or weekends. Didn't quite get that elusive podium. But yeah, when Haas decided that they wanted a driver with the same passport as Mick Schumacher, but with a little bit more experience, he was the obvious kind of choice. And I mean, he really took that opportunity, didn't he? He's looked very, very good in the last year or so. Kind of pretty handily beat Kevin Magnussen last season and has looked strong again this year. So yeah, I think it's an obvious choice not an obvious choice, but it's a very good choice for Audi. Obviously, we'll have that year with Stake first, but yeah, I think it's a big loss for Haas, more so than maybe it is a big gain for Audi.
Yeah, Ian, because if you speak to, sorry, Nick, just to add my thoughts on that. The thing is with Hulkenberg, if you speak to anybody that's worked with him, they will tell you just how hard he works in terms of understanding the car, understanding the circuit, trying to get the two to marry together. His feedback apparently is off the charts in terms of its attention to detail. And it's always been a surprise to me that he's never done better than his career initially suggested it would go on to become. So for him now to land this move, as you say, after those 3 almost wilderness years, just 4 sub appearances, COVID related, of course, where he deputised. I'm pleased for him. It's a cracking move, and quite clearly, he's gone one step further than Carlos Sainz has and decided to accept whatever mega pay packet is on offer, because he recognises for him, being a German driver, ultimately driving for one of the big name German manufacturers in 2026 is just as good as it's probably going to get for him at this stage of his career. So I'm nowhere near surprised that they've come to him in the first place, because they would have heard about all the feedback. And if they want to develop that car quickly, he's probably one of the best on hand to help them do so. But also, I'm not surprised, because if the rumours of the pay packets are to be believed, and Carlos Sainz has apparently been offered a substantial pay packet to move to Audi, then it's a good move as well for Nico at this stage of his career. Carlos, we know, is holding back because he doesn't know what to expect with Audi. To be fair, we don't know what to expect from many of the power unit manufacturers going into 2026, but you would expect the likes of Ferrari and Mercedes, who have a history of developing engines, power units, to be at the forefront going into those 2026 regulations, compared to an Audi that has never developed a power unit in its life of this caliber or ilk. So fascinating situation unfolding at Audi. Great move for Nico. Will Carlos join him? That's now the next big question as we go into Miami.
And you mentioned there about 2026. I suppose that's also a part of the reason why there's been these links between Verstappen possibly going to Mercedes, because there's a huge unknown with what Red Bull's powertrain will be like in 26. But just sticking with Hulkenberg for a second, when Audi, it was announced they'd be joining Formula One in 2026, it was rumoured that they wanted a German driver. There was talks of possibly Mick Schumacher initially, Sebastian Vettel. How important is it for Audi that they've got this German driver who can, lead the brand's image as well?
I think it's very important. I think it's, from a markability point of view, to make the project viable and to give it legs long term, you do need to bring, kind of marry that side of it to the performance aspect of it, actually performing on track and within F1. You need to make it a marketable proposition, and I think Nico Hulkenberg certainly does that. This isn't the first time that we've seen manufacturers of any kind of nationality wanting a driver of of their own from their own country in their car. Nico Rosberg, obviously Mercedes is based in the UK, the F1 team is, but it's a German brand, German driver. Same with Schumacher before here, where they had an all German lineup for a while, didn't they? So I think it's very, very important for them, and I think it unlocks a lot of opportunities in Germany as well for them.
Of course, Ian, with Nico Hulkenberg going to stake for 2025, and the rumours with obviously Carlos Sainz, what do you think this means for Zhou Guanyu and Valtteri Bottas, who are both without a contract at the end of this season?
Fascinating now as to which of those two drivers they opt for 25, or are they going to go down the same route, jettison both, and like they've done with Hulkenberg, sign him for 25 to obviously integrate him into the team for a year, for him to get to know the technical staff, the engineers, his mechanics, etc., going forward into what will obviously become the more crucial year of 2026 when Audi comes on board. So I know I've said in this podcast previously, and I said it obviously quite clearly following the Chinese Grand Prix, that I felt pretty much as Sam has just talked about there, from a marketability point of view with regard Hulkenberg going to essentially Audi, that retaining Zhou would, I thought, be crucial because of the marketability that he brings with him, as we quite clearly saw with the Chinese Grand Prix, and the market that would then open for Audi. But with them now bringing in Hulkenberg, you would assume that they are also going to want to bring in another top-level driver to sit alongside him, because they're going to want to progress that team as fast as they possibly can. So it's now looking like Valtteri and Zhou are skating on very thin ice for not just next season, but especially 2026. Fascinating situation unfolding for those guys, because we know with Valtteri, he's got the experience, proven race winner, albeit with Mercedes when it was at the peak of its dominance over the past decade. And Zhou, as I've just talked about, quite clearly has talent. Have we really seen it yet? I don't think so. There is something there, but of course he has the whole of China behind him, which is something very different when you're looking at the bigger picture for any major car manufacturer coming into F1 like Audi will be doing in 26.
Well, it definitely adds another element to what is going to be a crazy, silly season. For those who are watching on YouTube, let us know in the comment section what you think Stake will do next season. And for those who are listening to this podcast, let us know on the website or DM us on Instagram for your thoughts, so we can then discuss it in future podcasts, because we want to be interacting with our audience. Speaking of interacting with our audience, we'll get onto fan questions later on. Moving on, Sam, to the biggest report of last week, the biggest rumour regarding a certain Adrian Newey and possible links to Ferrari. Is it going to happen? Is it not going to happen? That seems to be the big question on everyone's lips.
Yeah, absolutely. And it feels like we're in this kind of this holding pattern now, where we're just waiting for that second shoe to drop almost. The first being the speculation and the rumour, the second being confirmation that it's true. So yeah, it's very difficult to know if it will be will be Ferrari. I think it's more likely that we're going to hear that he's leaving Red Bull, if he is indeed. Obviously, we don't know that for definite yet. The speculation is that he's been offered £100 million a year by Ferrari, which is obviously crazy money. But I think the more interesting question is, if he does leave Red Bull, I don't think it's it's a lock that it's Ferrari. There are other options out there. Aston Martin have known to have sent a very big offer his way. So I'm keen to hear what Ian thinks in terms of if there's any legs to any of those alternatives, at least.
I think for me, Ferrari is the strongest link. Adrian's been linked with Ferrari numerous occasions in the past. We know he's rebuffed offers from Ferrari in the past. From what I've been led to believe, and this goes back to earlier this season, Ferrari have, been keen to try and lure Adrian to Maranello again. Now, obviously, bearing in mind what's happened at Red Bull over the course of this season with the Christian Horner situation, with Adrian, as we're led to believe, not being happy with how all that has played out, it now looks likely that from everything we are, as I say, led to believe, that this could be Adrian's last season with Red Bull. It now becomes a question of, if that's the case, if we do get the announcement come through that he's going, of course, where is he going? And I'm going to say quite clearly, I think Ferrari, more than anybody else. How long will it take, though, for him to then join Ferrari? What are the discussions that have been going on behind the scenes? Because without a shadow of a doubt, within whatever the last contract Adrian signed, you would assume there would be quite a considerable gardening leave clause, whereby, yes, you can leave, but you are not going to work for another team for a good, considerable X number of months. the majority of people are rough, of a really high caliber are around about 6 months. And I would assume Adrian to be certainly to be something similar, if not perhaps even longer. Rumours of a year it could be. So It then becomes a question of, okay, for the competing team to get his signature, can we get that down? Can we bring him on board any quicker than that gardening leave period? Because there's no doubt that, without a shadow of a doubt, they are going to want him to be on board as quickly as possible to help out for 2026, because that is the key regulatory change now.
Because that's a really important point, because if there is a considerable gardening leave, and we understand that his contract is until the end of 2025, if they do hold him to that, or at least let him go early but extend the gardening leave, it could be into 2026, or maybe worst case scenario joining with the start of 2027, and then not necessarily having a huge impact on the car until a few months down the line, because there of course is a lag period, and that's further compounded by the cost cap. At which point Ferrari may have gone down, or whoever it might be, may have gone down a completely wrong direction, as almost Mercedes-esque with this regulation cycle. So it's fascinating to see how long it could be before his influence is shown in whichever team he eventually does join.
It's a really interesting point, because I think the last thing Red Bull would want if he were to join Ferrari is for Newey to have a significant say on Ferrari's 2026 car. If they can extend, until, if they can delay his arrival at Ferrari, perhaps past Hamilton, because that's another point. Who knows how long Hamilton will race for Ferrari for? It's that period of gardening leave is going to, I think, have a massive say possibly on how competitive Ferrari will become 2026. I think that is now really, which is as possibly now the biggest talking point we have now this season. Where will Newey go, or will he even go?
Along with Max, of course.
Well, yeah, there's still Max as well.
What's happening with Max? If you only have to look at quotes from his dad Jos that came out of an interview he did at the Rally Wallonia event that he took part in over the weekend. And, he's playing it a little bit coy, but again, not laying any cards on the table and simply saying, we've got to look to 26. So for me, there is another indicator that Max's colours are nowhere near being nailed to the mast of Red Bull for not only next year, but for 26 especially. 26 is becoming everything to everyone within that paddock. All these crucial moves are now being made because teams want the best drivers, they want the best technical people, quite obviously, because this is being seen by Mercedes and Ferrari especially as the opportunity to bring an end to this dominant Red Bull era that we are currently going through at present. 3 consecutive title victories for Max, and Red Bull going into now 24, into this season, into 25. It looks like, there's no stopping them this season, next season. So 26, the teams are doing everything they can to bring the best people on board, because they've got to end for them this Red Bull era, and it's an opportunity for them to win.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating from the kind of Verstappen camp as well. Obviously, the contract runs till 2028 for Max. Is that kind of gradual walking back of that we've seen over time? And Christian Horner has said himself in the past that he's not particularly keen on holding someone to a contract they don't want to be in. And then there was obviously the discussion or the suggestion that there's a break clause in Max's contract that's linked to Helmut Marko, who's a Verstappen ally. So there's so many different factors at play here. It's a very dynamic, multifaceted situation, and it's so interesting.
And just to add to that very quickly as well, you've only got to think of Dan Fallows, who left Red Bull, knew he's number 2 at that particular time, went to Aston Martin, but it took Aston Martin an awful long time to negotiate Dan out of the gardening leave period he had associated with his Red Bull contract at the time. So for any team wanting Adrian, this is not a cakewalk by a long stretch of the imagination. They are going to have to fight tooth and nail. Will more money swing it? Who knows? If they offered almost like, just look at, for all our Dutch listeners and readers, Arne Slot leaving Feyenoord to go to Liverpool. Liverpool have offered £9 million to get him out of his contract that he had with Feyenoord. Could something similar play out in Formula One? I've never really heard of that, to be honest, but it could be a way. Who knows?
The Racing News 365.com football podcast, everybody. Moving on, because I imagine we'll be coming back to Red Bull and Newey and Max probably in next week's podcast, but let's go and focus on Miami, because that is where we are this weekend. Sam, it is, as we've discussed, the sprint format once again. Who do you think that's going to suit best this weekend? Because we saw in China that Stake F1 and Haas in particular really made the most of, the sprint format.
Yeah, I, to be honest, I'm expecting similar, especially from Stake. The Sauber entrant has tended to like the Miami circuit in the past. They've gone pretty well there. Obviously, the first half of 2022, the Alfa Romeo was very, very strong and then just completely fell away. But yeah, so I would anticipate them being pretty good. And Haas as well, they've been much better over on race pace and tyre management. So yeah, I would stick with those two as kind of being the threat to the established top 5 teams. As for within that top 5, we know that McLaren are bringing upgrades, which Andrea Stella has said will be a decent step. Ferrari aren't. What we saw in Shanghai was it was kind of subverting what we were expecting. We thought Ferrari would be stronger there, and in the race, having made a compromise on setup that suited them in the race, Ferrari weren't able to get through in quite the way that at least Charles Leclerc was anticipating. And obviously Lando Norris took that very, very good P2 finish. So there's a very good chance the McLaren are the team that's up there fighting, I say fighting with Red Bull, but they could definitely be on the upper hand compared to Ferrari if they've played their upgrades right.
That's actually a really interesting point, Ian, because we are starting to see now almost a fight for second in the standings between Ferrari and McLaren, who both seem to be, not quite on a par with Red Bull, but they seem slightly ahead of Mercedes and Aston Martin. Do you think we're now starting to see where the fight for second this year behind Red Bull is going to come from?
Yeah, definitely. We've been given a clear indication over these first 5 races so far as to the pecking order. As you've pointed out, Ferrari have the edge over McLaren at present. They seem to have a car more suited to the majority of circuits. As you pointed out, though, Shanghai was not that great for them. We do know that they are going to bring upgrades for the race following Miami in Imola, that their home turf race, of course, or one of their 2 home turf races. So we should expect more from them from Imola onwards. So it could be again that maybe this weekend McLaren has a slight edge over Ferrari. And below them, yeah, we can quite clearly see that Mercedes struggling. What are they bringing this weekend? They've got to bring something more to the table. We know that from every weekend now on, they've got to try and just do something different with that car. They're struggling with setups. They keep making all these different setup changes. Lewis and George going in different directions pretty much at every event in terms of just trying to unlock the sweet spot of that car on any given circuit. And it's been a real struggle. As we know, Lewis finishing 9th in the last 3 Grand Prix. Unheard of, that kind of run from him going into this stage of the season. You got to think that this is the 6th race, and after this, we're a quarter of the way through. And at the present, Mercedes still really struggling. Aston Martin, a little bit hit and miss. Sometimes good, sometimes not so good. Fernando, once again, just extracting everything from that car every time he steps into it and proving to be the real mainstay of that team. real leader. And so for them, again, but they really need to push now Ferrari and McLaren to a greater extent than they have been doing if we are to make this an unfortunate, in some respects, four-way fight for what is second place, because obviously Red Bull just looked too strong.
Sam, anything to add?
I was just going to say, as we know, modern day F1 is all about second place. That's what we focus on. We don't talk about first place.
Well, obviously Miami, as we've seen with the sprint format in China, those who make the best start in FP1 typically have a good sprint. But obviously with the second part for May, that did make some changes to what we saw in China. But will it happen again this weekend? We'll find out on Saturday when the sprint takes place. Right, let's move on to some fan questions, because you guys watching and listening have been sending in your questions to our Instagram page. So, Sam, this one I think is going to come to you because you seem to be a bit of our tech guy. This question is from...
Don't say that.
No,
I'm
you
not
do
technical at all.
In our,
all the cars look the same to me.
well, in our team chats, you seem to be the guy who seems to know a bit more about the upgrades than we do. I'll be honest, when it comes to tech, I'm pretty useless. But this question is from Joey. How much extra power does ERS give the drivers exactly?
Right, so ERS is, as we know, energy recovery system, and essentially what that is it is using waste, heat, and kinetic energy from the car to essentially almost like a push-to-pass type system that you'd get in IndyCar to give it 160 brake horsepower for about half a minute a lap extra. So you can use that defensively or when you're attacking, however you want to use it. And yeah, so basically that's all kind of contained within the engine, and then it's controlled by the driver on the steering wheel.
Push to pass, push to defend as well. Bearing in mind it's used as quite a defensive tool as well.
Yeah.
I mean, fair play. That was some explanation. That is why you are now the tech guy. Next question is from Salman, and Ian, it's a good one for you because you did touch upon it earlier. Which team do you think Sainz is going to join?
Oh, blimey. Oh, dear. We've hypothesised over this to quite an extent on this podcast to a degree, and most certainly on the post-Chinese GP podcast, that's for certain. We know we are led to believe that he has this big offer from Audi, but he's sitting on the fence with it because, of course, as I've mentioned earlier, he's got no real indication as to how they're going to perform from 26 onwards, being not only just a new team on the grid, but as a new power unit manufacturer. At least he knows with Mercedes, has been linked there, of course, he knows what he's getting. Similarly, with Red Bull, he knows what he's getting in terms of the team, but Red Bull Powertrains is a new manufacturer on the grid, albeit, of course, they do have quite considerable experience in having worked with Honda over these past few years. So they're not going into it blind as such, Red Bull, with their powertrains department, but of course they will be, as Christian Horner put it, post-Chinese GP, they're pretty much 70 years behind Ferrari in terms of engine and power unit manufacturing development. So, but where is he going, to answer the question specifically? Oh boy, I don't know. Genuinely, I don't know. Because if I'm going to be pushed, I think he might just end up taking the Audi role.
I was going to say the same, because I'm getting the impression it's almost like he's obviously reluctantly in this position. He would have wanted to stay with Ferrari. And so he's almost putting off, he's procrastinating making that call, even though he knows he's going to have to do it at some point. And unless he can get exactly what he wants from, I think, Mercedes, I think Red Bull are going to stick with Perez. I think unless he can get exactly what he wants from Mercedes, which rumours suggest he wants a 2+1 deal, they want to give him a 1+1 deal. So I think he will eventually just come to the decision that the path of least resistance, the most straightforward thing, is just to go straight to Stake/Audi for next year.
The thing I think is really interesting with Carlos is that he's reaching the age where he should be at the peak of his career. That's the kind of point where he'll want to be with a team that can fight for the title, like Ferrari, particularly as they enter 2026. At Audi, realistically, unless they perform, something to the miracles of Brawn GP, the chances of Audi winning a title in their first couple of years is, I think, quite slim. But I guess it's part of what's an intriguing silly season that has started significantly earlier than we all thought. Thank you, Lewis Hamilton. Right, final question is from Janabasi, and I absolutely love this question. So Janabasi became an F1 fan through Drive to Survive, as did many others. How did we become F1 fans? Sam, I'll let you go first on that one.
So I feel like there's two kind of predominant ways into Formula One. There's the old school fans, and then there's the Drive to Survive fans. I'm an old school fan, and I am an F1 fan because of my father, which I'd imagine quite a lot of people are an F1 fan because of their parents' influence. So yeah, growing up, my dad used to watch F1. The first F1 race I can remember watching was the 2001 Australian Grand Prix. I remember being made to get up really early and watch that. So yeah, that was I'm sure many of you will know Fernando Alonso's F1 debut. There's also one Pablo Montoya, his debut, Kimi Räikkönen's debut, Enrique Bernoldi's debut. There's a name that Ian will remember. So yeah, there's that's what got me into F1, and it's been one of my main kind of pastimes ever since.
Ian?
Okay, this is where I now truly show my age to everyone listening and watching, because, indeed, because I can go back to the days of James Hunt winning his one and only title, of course, back in the late 70s. Because it was one of those that, James was a hero back in the day. My dad used to bring home a newspaper called The Sun for those in the UK, that you'll obviously know that one. Many people around the world should obviously have heard of The Sun. And the first thing I ever used to do was flick straight to the sports pages on the back when I was a kid. And for me, it was reading about F1, about football, about boxing, which were my three sports at the time. Yeah, boxing, even when I was 7, 8 years old. So there's a great boxing writer called Colin Hart, one of my heroes growing up in terms of the way he used to put things together on page. But yeah, in terms of F1 in particular, James did it for me. As I say, I remember, watching a few Grand Prix around that time when they used to be on terrestrial television in the UK. And that was it. I got the bug. I continued watching then through the 80s. And Formula One, though, as a journalist, was never my first choice. It was always football. Football was always my first love. And I became a football journalist from the age of 19. And eventually, when I joined a company called the Press Association back in 1996, I then had the opportunity to cover the odd Grand Prix over the first few years. And that was it. Then I was really bitten by the bug. And when the Press Association's F1 correspondent at the time departed, and I was offered the opportunity, that's it. Yeah, that was the never look back moment. And here I am all these years later, approaching somewhere like 300 Grand Prix attending now. I'd love to work it out, sit down and work it out one day, but it's really tricky. And so I go back to the late 70s and James, when I first saw F1. And as I say, that was it from then on.
Well, I think
what about yourself, Nick?
Well, I was saying, I think your flight to Miami is long enough to work out how many races you've attended. When you land in Miami, I expect in our work group chat a message. Well, you've got, how long's a flight? 8-9 hours?
Something like that, yeah.
Nah, it's enough time to do it. For myself, so it was my dad for me. So I was born in 1999, but my dad worked for F1 in 98. And effectively his job was to take a Ford Transit van in those days around the circuit, fitting all the curb cameras and the cameras you'd see that the TVs would use and the world feed. And that was, him. So he'd be destroying transit vans at a legal speed around the likes of Imola, Interlagos and everything. And obviously when he came back, he actually then had his own go-karting team. So for me, my entire childhood was spent, surrounded by petrol and go-karts and Formula One, and never looked back since. It's a lovely question, by the way, so thank you for telling that. And actually, it'd be amazing as well to get, for those on YouTube, let us know in the comment section how you got into F1 and your stories, because I'll be honest, those kind of questions I absolutely love, because I think, just from us three here, all our stories have slight similarities but slight differences, despite us, all being, different ages. I think it's brilliant. Right, we do need to go on to our penultimate talking point, and it's a sad one, because this weekend is obviously remembering Roland Ratzenberger and Ayrton Senna. It's been 30 years, incredibly, since we lost the pair of them. Ian, a few words on what is a very sad week, not just for F1 but actually for world motorsport.
Yeah, it was probably without a shadow of a doubt one of F1's darkest weekends. And if you remember, back then we had Friday qualifying, and we had the horrific incident with Rubens Barrichello crashing he was driving for Jordan at the time, and that car landed on top of the barrier, and he was supremely fortunate to escape with just some injuries that obviously then precluded him from driving for the rest of the weekend. But that then was the forerunner for what then followed. Obviously, today, we're recording this on Tuesday, April 30. Today is the anniversary of Roland Ratzenberger's untimely passing. He was only in his third F1 event with Simtech, was just trying to make his way up the F1 ladder, and his crash was recorded at 500 G, which is the highest recorded in F1 history. Front wing failure coming, I think, Sam, you covered this story quite extensively, if I remember right, this one. Front wing failure, and then that just propelled his car into a barrier, and he sustained injuries to such a level that any one of three that were listed could have ultimately have killed him. And then, of course, the day after, as if Roland wasn't bad enough, and F1 trying to get over that, which was, of course, the first death in F1 for 12 years. We then had Ayrton Senna, and no more needs to be really said, because he was a three-time F1 champion, an absolute legend of the sport. And the word legend, an old sports editor once told me, the word legend is so often overused in a sporting context. But on this occasion, without a shadow of a doubt, Ayrton was a legend. His death quite obviously came too soon. And 30 years now since his passing, and here we are. And of all the F1 drivers that have come and gone, his is the one name that we still look back on to this day whenever the anniversary of his death does come round. And why? Well, I'll give you the words of Bernie Ecclestone, Formula One Supremo. I interviewed him last week to get his thoughts, and he quite simply said that Ayrton was just different to any other driver he had come across in terms of his personality, his character. And of course, on track, he was to be revered, respected. And ultimately, here we are, 30 years on, we still remember.
Sam, anything to add on those beautiful words?
No, I think Ian's kind of put it very, very poignantly. I think someone like Ayrton Senna is synonymous with Formula One. The yellow helmet, and especially in the red and white McLaren, is just iconic. He was a titan of the sport. But also, I think it's incredibly important to remember Ronald Ratzenberger as well. That was and we talked recently about the legacy of safety in Formula One. Ratzenberger hit a concrete barrier, which was part of the kind of the situation there. And so I think it's important to remember their legacies, but continue to look forward as to how that can inform how Formula One develops, and as Formula One has done over the last 30 years.
There is a dedicated section on the RacingNews365.com website to look back on Ratzenberger and Senna with some absolutely amazing interviews. So be sure to check out all of that content on the RacingNews365.com website, as I just mentioned. Just finally, it is the end of the podcast. It means we do have to do a very quick, bold prediction for the Miami Grand Prix. I'm going to go first because I've thrown this upon the both of you, even though you should expect this by now. I'm going to say that despite the fact Red Bull will be very, very strong, we're going to have a Lando Norris win. Bold take, but you know what? My bold predictions of what I've become known for. So, Lando Norris win. Sam?
Well, I'll buy myself some time and say that I do hope Lando wins, because he will no doubt have a ridiculous helmet on this weekend. I think we've had a basketball and a beach ball the last 2 years in Miami, so I'm sure he'll look very festive doing so. I think bold prediction. I think double Red Bull retirement.
Oh, that is bold. Ian?
On what basis? Mechanical failure or incident?
Absolutely
Anything.
no. I mean, no. I have no grounds for this. It's just I think one will be an incident. One will be I'll split. I'll split my my bet. One incident. One mechanical failure.
That is very bold. That is mystic. If that comes off, that is truly mystic, and we will in future drop the Young Sports Journalist of the Year intro and come up with something suitably appropriate if that actually does happen. I can't be as bold as either of those, because those two are just so outlandish. And I'm just outlandish, even if you want to go that far. I like it, like the link. I'm just going to simply go Fernando podium, because where can I go?
Yeah, good point. We have
a Lando win and a double Red Bull retirement. So I'm just going to go Alonso podium. There we go.
What I like is that all three of those could happen at the same time. So we could all be sitting here looking pretty good a week from now.
Yeah. Then this podcast is probably going to be running away very quickly from a lot of angry people, I would have thought. Anyways, that's a good point to end on. If it does come true, then, well, we will all be very smug in next week's episode. From myself, Ian, and Mystique Sam, this has been the RacingNews365.com podcast. We will catch you on Friday for the first F1 update of the Miami Grand Prix. Catch you later.
Cheers, folks.
Bye.